My name is Aarav, and for as long as I can remember, our home in South Delhi has been quiet, not peaceful, just restrained. My father, Dr. Mehta, is a man of few words and even fewer emotions. A retired professor of political science, he sees the world in binaries, right or wrong, tradition or rebellion. There's no room for gray, no space for someone like me. I was sitting on the living room sofa, flipping through a worn copy of the picture of Dorian Gray, when the doorbell rang. My father, unusually eager, got up himself to answer it. That's when I saw him for the first time. Rajeev, uncle. He stepped in with the ease of someone returning home, even though he hadn't been here in years. Dressed in a charcoal kurta and a mild scent of sandalwood, Rajeev uncle had a certain grace about him, refined, but not showy. His salt and pepper beard framed a gentle smile, and when his eyes met mine, something in his gaze lingered. Not long enough to be inappropriate, but enough to make me look away. "Yeah, Aarav hai?" he asked, setting his leather duffel bag down. "Pikli bar to kota bakchada. Ab to, coffee badal gaya hai." My father laughed, an unusual sound, and nodded. "Pada hai English literature. Thoda alag hai." "Alag eka hoda hai," Rajeev replied, his voice calm, almost musical. That evening, dinner felt warmer than usual. My mother had passed away 3 years ago, and since then, our meals had become functional affairs, quiet, brief, mechanical. But Rajeev filled the silence effortlessly. He cracked old college jokes, teased my father about his stubbornness, and even asked me about my favorite poets. "You like Wilde?" he asked, noticing the book beside me. I nodded. "And Rilke. Sometimes Sylvia Plath." He raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Ah, the heavyweights of introspection. Dangerous territory for someone your age." There was no judgment in his tone, just intrigue. I didn't know what to say, so I smiled politely and retreated to my room as soon as dinner ended. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about how his eyes seemed to see something in me I hadn't realized was visible. The next few days passed in a rhythm I didn't expect. Rajeev uncle would join me on the veranda in the mornings with his coffee, asking about my college, my writing, even my silences. He never asked directly, but he always made space for honesty. Once, when I mentioned that I hadn't written in weeks, he said, "Writer's block isn't a lack of words, Aarav. It's fear. Of truth, usually." It felt as though he were speaking not just to me, but into me. At night, my father would sleep early, and Rajeev would stay up, reading Urdu poetry or sipping quietly on masala chai. I found myself drawn to the living room during those hours, pretending to grab a book or look for charger cables, but really just wanting to exist in that orbit of calm understanding. One night, during one of these silent encounters, he read aloud from Faiz Ahmed Faiz. "Gam hai, shakbi hai, or sabarbi. Tum milt ho to lagda hai zindagi hai." I didn't respond. I didn't know how. But something about the way he said it, like he meant it, like he'd lived it, left me awake for hours. My father remained oblivious, or maybe he chose not to see it. Rajeev was, after all, his closest friend, his only friend, really. They'd shared hostel rooms, heartbreaks, and debates that stretched past midnight. He trusted him, implicitly, but I had begun to sense something else. A pause too long in conversation, a compliment that felt like it had another layer. I caught Rajeev looking at me once, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me wonder, had anyone ever looked at me like that before? The house, once silent, now hummed with something unspoken. Then, one evening, as he brushed past me in the corridor, his hand touched mine. A casual accident. A blink-you-miss-it moment. But I didn't blink. And I didn't miss it. He turned back, his voice low. "Sorry." I nodded, but the air around us felt heavier. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared, but because, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. End of Section 1, 700 words. Would you like to continue with Section 2, the affair and inner turmoil next? Certainly. Here's Section 2, the affair and inner turmoil of Papa Ke Dost, Hindi gay love story, written in a clear, emotionally rich narrative with exactly 700 words. Section 2. Kia ye galat hai? Is this wrong? Rajeev uncle's touch, however brief, had stirred something I wasn't ready to name. In the days that followed, I became hyper-aware of his presence, his footsteps in the hallway, the soft clearing of his throat before speaking, the way his eyes held mine just a moment too long. Yet, everything remained unsaid. No words, no confessions, just a quiet, growing tension that hung between us like breath on glass. My father remained unaware. His days were spent reading the newspaper, watching old news debates, or taking afternoon naps. Rajeev, on the other hand, had begun occupying a space that once felt empty inside our home, and increasingly inside me. One rainy afternoon, power went out. The sky had turned a deep, moody gray, and the downpour drummed steadily on the windows. My father was asleep in his room, undisturbed by the storm. I sat in the living room, surrounded by candlelight and shadows, pretending to read while my heart waited. Rajeev walked in with 2 mugs of chai. He handed me one without a word, then sat across from me. For a while, the silence between us felt natural, like something earned. Then he said, without preface, "You remind me of someone I loved a long time ago." I looked up. His eyes weren't searching. They were remembering. "Did he love you back?" I asked, unsure where the question came from. He smiled, but it was a sad, distant thing. He tried to. But love doesn't survive well in cages. The room was still, except for the rain and the gentle clink of his ring against the ceramic mug. I wanted to ask more, but the air between us had thickened. Suddenly, without thinking, I stood up and walked toward the window. My reflection in the glass merged with the rain outside. I felt his presence behind me before I heard him move. "You don't have to be afraid of who you are," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I don't know who I am," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "All I know is that when you look at me, I feel seen. And that scares me." He didn't touch me. Not then. But something in the way he exhaled told me he understood. That night, long after the storm had passed and the house had settled into silence, I found myself outside his door. I don't remember deciding to go. I only remember standing there, heart racing, knuckles trembling before I knocked. He opened it, already dressed in his kurta, a soft light from the lamp behind him casting long shadows across the room. He didn't speak. He just stepped aside, letting me in. What happened between us wasn't rushed. It wasn't loud. There were no declarations, no dramatic pauses, just touch, breath, and a kind of aching honesty. The world outside ceased to matter. There was no father, no consequence, no shame, only 2 men who had spent their lives pretending not to need what they finally found in each other. His fingers were gentle, his eyes never once looking away. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "Yes," I said, without hesitation. For the first time in years, I wasn't unsure of myself. By the time I returned to my room, the early light of dawn had begun to slip. 3 days passed after that night. 3 days of silence, swelling inside me like water behind a dam. Rajeev remained unchanged, composed, courteous, impossibly calm. I began to resent that composure. How could he act as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't crossed a boundary so deeply carved into my world? I avoided him, retreating to my room under the pretense of exams and fatigue. But it wasn't avoidance, it was self-preservation. I couldn't bear the way he moved so effortlessly through our home, sipping chai with my father, chatting about politics and old hostile memories, all while the memory of his hands on my body lingered like a secret bruise. The guilt came in waves, crashing hardest in moments of silence. I started replaying everything: the touch, the gaze, the breathless yes. Each recollection felt more damning than the last. It wasn't regret I felt, it was consequence. And I wasn't ready for it. One evening, after dinner, I found my father alone in the study, sipping whiskey, his eyes tired. Maybe it was the whiskey, maybe it was the way he looked, aged, softer, human, but something in me cracked. "Papa," I began, not sure where I was going. He looked up, surprised by my voice. I never initiated conversation. Han, beta. I swallowed. My throat burned. Rajeev, uncle, he made me uncomfortable. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. His glass stilled midair. He didn't blink. He just stared. What do you mean? He asked slowly, every word like glass. I mean, he crossed a line. There. It was out. Not the full truth, not a detailed confession, but enough to fracture the illusion. My father stood, quietly, placed his glass on the table, and walked out without another word. That night, Rajeev left. No confrontation. No argument. Just a quiet packing of his bag, a final nod to my father, and then he was gone. I watched from the window as he slid into an auto rickshaw and disappeared into the late-night traffic, swallowed whole by the city. The house returned to its earlier silence, but it wasn't the same. This silence had edges. It cut. In the days that followed, my father didn't speak to me unless absolutely necessary. His gaze never met mine. Meals became shorter, colder. He didn't ask for explanations, and I didn't offer any. Our home became a place of walls, not rooms. I wanted to feel relief, but what I felt was emptiness. I tried writing, poetry, stories, fragments of memories, but the words felt dishonest, filtered. My mind kept circling back to that night with Rajeev, not for what we did, but for what it exposed in me. The need, the longing, the quiet desperation to be noticed, to be understood, to be loved in a way that felt true. Rajeev had given me that briefly, dangerously, and then he had taken it away without looking back. Weeks passed. One afternoon, while dusting old books in the living room, I found a folded piece of paper tucked inside a volume of Caleb. It was addressed to me. Rajeev's handwriting. Aarav. We all carry wounds we didn't choose. You and I, ours were different, but they met for a moment in honesty. I won't say I'm sorry because what happened between us was not cruel, but I am sorry for what it cost you. Find your voice. Don't be afraid of it. That's the only thing that's ever saved me. R. I held the note for a long time, unsure whether to tear it, burn it, or hide it. In the end, I kept it in the back of my journal, between unfinished poems and scribbled thoughts. Life began to move again. Slowly. I went back to college. I started writing again, this time without fear. The story of what happened between Rajeev, my father, and me was never spoken aloud. But it lived in the spaces between pages, in poems about rain and longing and the fragile weight of secrets. My father and I never revisited that night. Some silences, I learned, become foundations, not of trust, but of survival. Even now, some nights, I pass the guest room and pause. The door stays shut, the bed neatly made. But I remember, not with anger, not even with sadness, just with the quiet ache of something that was once real and briefly mine. Winter had arrived quietly. The kind of Delhi winter that turned window panes cold to the touch and made the city seem softer, slower. Inside our home, the stillness had settled again, but this time it was no longer unfamiliar. It had become part of the structure, like old paint or a creaking floorboard. Something to live with, not fix. It had been 2 months since Rajeev left. 2 months since the moment that rewrote my understanding of love, guilt, and consequence. Time hadn't made it disappear, it had only changed its shape. My father and I now lived like two people with a treaty neither of us had signed. We shared the same air, but not the same world. Mornings were filled with muted sounds, clinking cups, shuffling slippers, occasional coughs, but not words. We existed side by side, not out of comfort, but because neither of us knew how to start again. I had begun writing more. Not stories, not yet, but pieces. Vignettes of memory, fragments of emotion. I wrote about eyes that watched gently, about rain that knew too much. I didn't use names. I didn't need to. The page knew exactly who I was talking about. One evening, while returning from the library, I passed an old man at the chai stall, humming phoees under his breath. Tum aho, na shabi intizar guzri hai. Something in those words shattered the fragile distance I had created between memory and feeling. I stopped, stood still in the winter air, and let it all return. Rajeev's voice reading poetry. The warmth of his palm. The silence that followed our night together, not out of indifference, but out of restraint. He hadn't stayed. But he hadn't run either. He had simply known when to leave. I found myself wondering, even now, was it wrong what happened? Or was it just unaccepted? In the safety of my journal, I wrote, "We are all just stories waiting to be forgiven." The next morning, I saw something unexpected. My father's study door was ajar. He was reading one of my notebooks. I froze.
He didn't speak.
He closed the journal, gently, and looked up at me, not with anger, but with something heavier. Recognition. "I always thought I was protecting you," he said quietly. "Turns out, I was just keeping you small."
I didn't know what to say.
This was more than I'd heard from him in months. I didn't know how to react. "When you said what you did about Rajeev," he continued, "not because of what he did, but because I realized how far apart you and I had grown." My throat tightened. "I didn't tell you everything." "I figured," he said softly. "But maybe you didn't have to." That was the beginning of something, not a resolution, not forgiveness, but space. A possibility. He didn't ask for explanations. And I didn't offer justifications. But we began having tea together again. In silence, yes, but side by side. That was enough for now. One night, I opened my email and found a message with no subject line. Just one line inside. "You still carry too much in your chest. Let it out. Start with your story."
R.
No sender name. But I knew who it was from.
I stared at it for a long time.
Then I opened a new document and began to write, not about love, not about betrayal, but about a boy who once felt invisible and a man who made him feel seen, if only briefly. The next day, I walked past the guest room again. I stopped. I opened the door. The air inside was still, untouched since Rajeev had left. But it wasn't empty. It held echoes.